this is Pat Atkinson from Kettering University in Flint, Michigan, and I want to welcome you to this webinar today. It's great to have you on board. We're going to talk about how to spur the ideas in your students where they can come up with an opportunity that they can then spend a semester or whatever time frame you wish to use in your class solving that particular problem. So let me get started. Let me get into the notes here. And here we are. We call these up. All right. So, and I should also acknowledge my collaborator, Professor Eric Meyer from Lawrence Tech University. So let's get started. Just as far as a little time frame, we started this project in winter of 2014. It was actually the grant was approved in 2013, and we worked in quarters here at Kettering. So in the winter quarter, we did our first run, and then we refined it in spring of 2014. And it was also trialed down at Lawrence Tech in the Detroit area in spring of 2014. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the time frame. And now let's get into the work. As probably a lot of you know, Keene has gone through several evolutions of the model for developing entrepreneurial projects, and this I think is a very nice one. This is the latest, greatest, and it's very clean, it's very neat, and I think it's very easy to get your head around. And I credit Keene with the time and effort to do this because largely there's very little out there in the literature, and this I think gets us all on the same page, so we're all kind of pulling in the same direction. And it mirrors what successful companies are doing out there in industry. So there's three phases: the opportunity, the design, and the impact. In this talk today, I'm going to focus on the items that are boxed in there. And I'm sure, as most people know, it's very difficult in any one project to address everything. And if you do that, sometimes it's problematic because it's so stuffed full of topics that I've found that these topics here actually link together in a nice project. And hopefully you'll agree once you've seen this talk today. So let's focus here on the line at the bottom that maybe you don't notice at first blush, but it says these specific skills reinforce the development of an entrepreneurial mindset. And it's those last two words that are so key. And let's dig into that. An entrepreneurial mindset it can be easily thought of as three things: curiosity. And if you have curiosity, that takes you through to forming connections between ideas and customers, etc. And ultimately, you want to create value for somebody downstream who would then be interested in your product or ideas. So let's get into the details here. And I think it's important to note that curiosity is I don't know if it's a skill or an attribute or however you want to think about it, but Sir Ken Robinson tells us that curiosity is the engine of achievement. Now, I happened to have the pleasure of going to the fall meeting in Wisconsin for the Keene group, and there was a short video that was played of Mr. Curran, and it struck me that he said, if you are not curious, you will walk by 1,000 opportunities in your life and not even know it. So I think it's important that we work with our students to ensure that they're being curious about the world and the environment around them. Connections. Stephen Johnson is credited with saying, chance favors the connected mind. And it can be between different technologies, between different people, between different computer networks. Sometimes we need to make connections and then fix the connections. Maybe a connection that's human to human needs to be interspersed with computers, etc. So trying to find the right connections is challenging. And if we can be curious and have the connections formed, then we can create value for our customer. Henry Ford is credited with saying that success is about creating value. And I think we all, of course, want to be successful ourselves and for our students. So here are the topics I'm going to address. I want to focus initially on how do you identify an opportunity. One of the things I like to do with my students, and I think most faculty do this, you have your own set of case studies. And here is the three I like to use. Imagine that you are going to be a biker and you don't want to mess up your hair. Women, perhaps you have a hairdo like that. How are you going to put a helmet on that? And so there's a group out of Europe who came up with an invisible helmet. And I asked my students, how would you make an invisible helmet? And it turns out this lady here is actually wearing the helmet. And what it is it's actually that scarf, and in the event of a certain magnitude of acceleration to the body, the helmet deploys and it forms an airbag, a protective airbag around the head. So this is a clever idea. It's expensive. It's $450. It's single use, but it solves a problem, and this company is now successful. What about moving goods and surfaces around the world? And somewhat surprisingly, it comes down to a metal box. Malcolm McLean, back in the 50s, noticed he had a trucking company, and he noticed that his trucks were stuck on the roads on the eastern seaboard, near the eastern seaboard, and they didn't have very good highway systems back then. This was really before the interstate highway, and his truckers could see ships moving in the water back and forth without traffic. Of course, on the water, if you come upon some other boats, you just shift over a little bit, and you can keep moving. Where on the roads, if you hit traffic, you have to slow down. So his initial idea was actually to drive trucks onto the ships, and then they would be able to move more easily. And then he started to realize, well, I don't even need to put the truck on there. I just need a metal box. And so this metal box has really changed how we move goods and services, or at least goods, around the world. And I was driving home one day and listening to NPR, and they had a story on this. It really intrigued me. And so now I talk about metal boxes with my students. And ultimately, Malcolm McLean realized that he would have to standardize the world, so he worked very hard, and every port in the country or in the world has actually adopted certain standards for a certain size box, and then you can put these boxes on the boats and load and offload them. In the old days, you'd actually have to load and offload things, just onesie, twosie pieces of material, packages, etc. It would sometimes take several weeks to turn around a boat, to unload and load it at a port, and now they can do it in a fraction of that time. And now you can also even move these boxes by rail. So it's a huge innovation, and it's one of the reasons things are so cheap in the stores is because of this box innovation. Imagine vacuum cleaners. Vacuum cleaners might not sound very exciting, but this guy, Sir James Dyson, thought they were. And his claim to fame is taking mundane problems and making them better. And so Electrolux, which is kind of the Cadillac of vacuum sweepers in days past, has been taken over by products like Dyson's products, in which he's using computational fluid dynamics and other high-end engineering tools to solve this mundane problem. In the old days, a lot of the devices were made by trial and error, and Dyson realized he could do it better. So this all leads to this question of these products and ideas you just saw were the hard work and the result of entrepreneurs doing what they do. And I don't know if you can chalk it up to just the fact that engineers tend to be a little more conservative, but a lot of my students, at least, find the concept of entrepreneurship to be a little bit outside their comfort zone. The idea of being an entrepreneur, of course, is that you are willing to undertake a big task and are willing to put a lot of your time and money invested into it. Instead, what we notice is our students are a lot more comfortable with the concept of an intrapreneur. That is, be at a company where you get a regular paycheck, you've got a parking spot, you've got all the stuff that goes with going to a place of work, but you then innovate within the company. And for a lot of our students, they're more comfortable with that concept. And we know this because we've surveyed them, and Lawrence Tech University was helpful in providing me with an entrepreneurship survey. And what we learned was the students are full of energy, they want to succeed, they have passion, they want to build things. And a small number of our students want to be entrepreneurs. A much larger percentage want to be intrapreneurs. And some of the students actually are neither. They're still trying to discover what they want to be. But the net effect is that most of the kids want to be an intrapreneur. Now, for all of our students, our message to them, and I think it's kind of just part of human nature, you're going to be most excited to work on things that make you happy, for which you have a passion. And so trying to figure out what that is sometimes a challenge for kids and young people and old people alike. But I think it really is based on this concept of creativity. You need to be aware of what you like and don't like, and then somehow mesh that with what is needed out there. And it's going to involve some creativity to link those two. And if you look at the definition of creativity, that means people who are clever or ingenious. And our engineering students certainly are that. So how do we come up with an idea? Well, there's certain techniques and skills we can pursue that seem to be pretty effective at coming up with that great idea. So let's first start off with the definition of the word opportunity. If you look it up in the dictionary, you'll find out it's kind of actually a generic definition. It just means a good chance for success, which I think most people would want to achieve that. And so how do we do that? Well, sometimes in industry or in just coming up with ideas, you'll have a solution that's in search of a problem. Other times you're faced with a problem that needs a solution. Now, what's the glue that holds those two together? And it's opportunity. If you have a solution, that's an opportunity to solve a problem. If you have a problem, that's an opportunity to solve or to seek a solution. And the way I think about it, and I think the way most people think about it, is you can go either route. You can either start with the solution or the problem and work towards the other. And the bottom line is we need to start with, however, a kernel of a problem that we can then build on. So that takes us to this concept of opportunity ideation. So what are ways in which we can get our students to kind of focus their energies on coming up with an opportunity? Sometimes the opportunity is very clear, sometimes it moves around, it's a moving target, but there are techniques. The techniques I used were shown here, and I'll describe those in greater detail in just a second. And these seem to work well for my students. There's obviously a large variety of ways in which you can basically brainstorm is basically what this is. But these seem to work well for my students, so that's kind of what I've stuck with so far. And improving an existing product, all of our students have experience with healthcare products. And so we thought, well, what could make them better? That's obviously an incremental design idea. Personal experience, a number of my students have either been ill themselves or have had family members who have been ill, and medical science was not able to either treat their problem at all or wasn't able to fully treat it. And so is there something that's missing? Is there a gap in the medical products that are available on the market? Networking. All of my students have dentists, they have doctors that care for their family. A number of the kids had a cousin or an aunt or an uncle who was in the medical field. So they were also asked to contact those people and see what was the biggest problem they were struggling through. And the last one that I used was build a grid. And I credit Doug with this. Doug came and gave us a talk a few years back, and he had us break up into groups and come up with a list of people, just randomly come up with a list of people, put them as row headings, and then come up with a list of technologies, make those column headings, and see where there might be an intersection between the two in which a certain piece of technology, which was designed for one group of people, could be applied to a new group of people. And the example I love to give is a lot of young people love their wireless devices, and somebody decided, well, let's use that technology for the necklace that an elderly person could wear, where if they've fallen, the product I've fallen and I can't get up, that type of thing. And it's great that technology already exists. You have a new market segment, and that's a great opportunity. It solves a problem, and it's got a solution all in one. Another one that you'll see coming up later is my students started to realize that 3D TVs, which people like at their home, would be really great for surgeons, and I'll expound on that a little bit more later. So here's an example where one type of technology can be appropriated or repurposed for somebody else, kind of like I just mentioned with the wireless technology for the elderly. Probably a lot of you know that CNC programming, computer numerically controlled machines, were developed, well, let's say a half a century ago, somewhere like that. And ultimately, that technology was used to develop plotters for roll-sized drawings. And that technology was then repurposed for home printers, which was repurposed for 3D printing, which has led to our rapid prototyping of today. And so if you can draw it on a computer, you can build it. And so we see this kind of circuitous route where we go from the CNC all the way down to 3D printing. And it's where somebody was smart. They took a piece of existing technology and they repurposed it. So I find this grid opportunity ideation exercise to be very popular, and a lot of the ideas my students came up with this semester was based on the grid. So you may ask yourself, how are you going to take students and quickly expose them to the medical field? I should point out that at Kettering, we offer our bioengineering classes as a minor. So they major typically in mechanical engineering, and then they minor in bioengineering. And so they might be a junior before they take the bioengineering course. And I know other schools, for example, Lawrence Tech, offer a degree in bioengineering, so they probably had those students have the benefit of having a lot more exposure to medical devices, medical technology, etc. So the way I do this to try and make this happen as quickly as possible is immersion. And I take the students and I put them into the environment of their customer. And in this case, I'm thinking of their customer as one customer would be the surgeon. And so how do we do this? Well, I've developed a site called Dollar Store Surgery on YouTube, and there are a host of videos. And here's an example of one. This is how do you remove somebody's diseased gallbladder. And we start by developing the surgical skills of our students. So they take a nut and put it on a bolt outside of a box. Then they hold onto it with surgical tools, put the nut on the bolt. Then they do it inside of a box, as you can see here, through little holes in the front. And what we're trying to do is develop some hand-eye coordination. You'll find if you do this with students, some students are built to be a surgeon, others are not. And then from there, we work on a hot dog outside of the box, and we use hot dogs that have casing or skin on them, and the students have to close a wound. And one of the sayings in surgery is soft hands. And so they have to have enough pressure on the suture to close the wound without tearing through the casing. And it's a delicate tipping balance there, or tipping point there. Once they put the suture in, they have to cut the suture and then do the whole process now inside the box. Now to kick it up a notch, now we cover the box and you have to use a camera. We've tried different technologies over the years. Either on the right there is a little TV with a little tiny spy camera. On the upper image there, we use an electrician camera that an electrician would use to peer behind a wall. And then down on the lower left, we have the use of a cell phone. And all are very effective. Once they've gotten their feet wet by doing that initial exercise, we now have them go into a fake patient, and they have to use the camera to identify and surgically remove the gallbladder. And I give them very little training on this. They already have had a brief introduction on the anatomy, so they know where the gallbladder is, and they have to make their own puncture wounds. This happens to be the abdomen right there, and the patient's below that. And they have to get the gallbladder out. The gallbladder is right there in the middle. And after we're done with the actual surgical experience, we go ahead and show them a video from a real surgery. And it's really interesting. The students always end up going towards the actual surgical solution. They struggle with this, they struggle with that. Eventually they figure out the way to do it. When they watch the video, they're always surprised at how their solution matches very closely to the actual surgical method. The other thing, too, is when you watch a surgical video, and I got a little graphic at the bottom, it's a little gross. I made it kind of small so I wouldn't gross them out before lunch. But they look at all these different anatomical structures through this little camera view, and that's what these are. This is somebody's abdomen, and there's some poke holes, and there's some cameras and instruments that go in those holes. But anyways, they understand exactly what they're looking at and are very well versed in understanding the spatial relationship of what is occurring. We also do a balloon angioplasty exercise where they have to clear a blockage at the end of a tortuous path using a balloon. They build a leg from scratch. We give them the hard foam bones. They then cut out the muscles, ligaments, and tendons, put on the neurovascular structures, nerves, arteries, and veins. And after they're all done, we pull thick, opaque pantyhose over the leg, and then we use this as a model for the next couple surgeries. And this is a really nice kinesthetic way of teaching anatomy. The spatial relative position of items are very well known because you've actually cut them out and attached them to this model. Now once we cover them with, here's the pantyhose right there. And this first surgery is we take the leg, we break the femur in bending, and then we reattach the two ends of the bone, or the two fragments of bone, with a fracture plate. And we use for those who are maybe in the bioengineering area, we use a DCP plate, a dynamic compression plate, to compress the fracture. And so students have to learn how to drill the holes, eccentric in the hole, all the different techniques that are involved there. We then imagine that our leg, our patient, gets older and eventually gets hip arthritis. So we then go through and I give the students a hip joint replacement, as you can see in the lower right-hand corner, and I say, you need to replace this person's hip. They say, well, where do I make my incision? I say, well, you know where all the important structures are. You've built this leg. And they all make typically a lateral incision. They avoid the neurovascular structures in the anterior and posterior side, go in from a lateral approach and miss all the bad stuff, and give them a little bit of mentorship as they go, but not too much. I want them to kind of find their own way. You can see right here, you may have caught that these students actually fractured the femur when they pounded in their femoral component. So they under-reamed. So they had to actually pull the component and ream some more. And so we let them make their mistakes and persevere through failure. Here's an example where now our patient's got knee arthritis. We give them a knee joint replacement and say, get this in there. And they struggle and they cause problems. Sometimes they cut one of the collateral ligaments. They have to repair it themselves. And we let them go in and make all the cuts and implant that knee joint replacement. So one other element of this is that I was going to put all these videos online. That was my intention. And I noticed that a lot of videos, or at least some of the videos that are out there on the web, maybe you've noticed, sometimes they're kind of dry and boring. So I tried to get creative, and working with my students, we put together a green screen studio, and I developed this alter ego called Dr. Bioengineering. And we shot all these videos, and we had a lot of fun with it. And we did some silly little things like on the videos, I'd put tape on my glasses. I don't wear glasses, but on my fake glasses there. And then sometimes I had no tape, but just silly little things. So if you do go to the YouTube channel, I have half of my videos are called student versions, which are kind of funny and quirky. And then I have instructor versions that are a little bit more to the point. So after all of this, students have got some experience from their own life. They've now had experience in the OR. And from this experience, they need to come up with some kind of an idea that is an opportunity for a new product or service for the medical community. So let me focus on that. They need to investigate the market, see what's already out there, make sure their idea is fresh, and also they need to create a preliminary business model. We lecture to them about the simplicity of the business model. It comes down to two things. Who are your customers, who's your target audience, and what is your value proposition? So to do that, I required them to come up with a 1-minute pitch, and it's going to be shown to a physician. A local physician comes into the classroom, and to bring the pitch, I made the students a little uncomfortable. What I found in my experience as a professor, I've been doing this almost 20 years, students love to submit reports. It's very passive and not very personal. They submit the report, they walk away, the professor grades it. They're a little more uncomfortable giving a live presentation. And then I discovered during my work here, they're even more uncomfortable making a video. So I had to make a video where they had to basically make a commercial that described their business model. And to do this, we took that green screen studio I mentioned before. Students had to write their own scripts, bring their own music, their own backdrops. Here's the backdrop for this guy. And what this student was interested in was he is allergic to certain foods. And so he wanted to develop an app that he could put on his phone, take some little litmus paper, touch it on the food like at a restaurant, put it in this little device on his phone, and have it do a little assay or analysis of the food. So he developed this character he called Joe, who likes pizza, but doesn't know what's causing his stomach discomfort. Here's an example where students, when they did surgery, they realized they would love to know where all of the vascular and neural structures are. So they developed a vein artery imaging device so they could make their incisions and avoid the vascular structures underneath the skin when they make their incision. everybody's anatomy is just a little different from each other. And so they wanted to get a custom view of that person's vasculature before they made their incision. In this group, you can see right there, when they were doing their suturing, this student had a recollection from her childhood where she had some black stitches in, and it kind of didn't really create a physical scar because that healed over, but it created a mental scar where whenever she looked in the mirror, she thought there was spiders crawling on her skin. And doing the surgery in class reminded her of this, kind of brought it back into her mind. And so she wondered, why can't we have colored stitch or an invisible stitch or a color that's not so scary? And they have colored cast material. Why not colored stitch material? So that was their idea. And these students, just one more example, put together the intersection of wireless technology and soldiers and said, why couldn't soldiers have on a second skin underneath their uniform that would identify where a puncture wound might be and also take basic vital stats that could be communicated to a medic. And so a lot of different ideas there, and we then need to see what the customer thinks. So we used our physician, who doesn't know anything about the class, to give us his idea, and the physician came in, watched the videos, was able to do a little bit of Q&A with the students, and then develop a written response so that the students could take this to heart and see if they needed to redesign their idea at all. Now let's move on to assessing policy and regulatory issues. So if you have an idea for a product, you then need to make sure that the proper organizations are going to approve it, and the proper organization in most of these cases is the Food and Drug Administration. And FDA says you need to classify a product as either relatively benign or poses moderate risk or poses a high level of risk. Now, if it's a class 1 product, it doesn't bear too much scrutiny by the FDA. A class 2 product, you have to submit something called a 510K, and that's all that is the line or the paragraph and line from a Food and Drug Act, which tells us that you can get Class 2 products approved with a moderate level of regulation. And then Class 3s pose a great deal of risk and require lots and lots of oversight. So a little bit more on that. The 510K for a Class 2, and by the way, I should just go back and say, no matter what class our students developed, I forced them into the 510K where they had to 510K their product. And I'll explain what that is here right now. So 510K says if you can prove that your device is substantially equivalent to a device that existed prior to May 28th of 1976, then we can say that it is safe for use going forward. And what happened is, after that date, back in the 70s, people linked their device to a device that already existed before that was safe and effective. And then people would link a future device to the one just before it. And so now you have this whole family and history of these linkages that go from device to device to device to device all the way back to prior to that date. And the reason why the FDA did that was there was a series of just terrible, terrible products that had gone out and had unintentionally hurt and killed lots of people. And so they finally put a line in the sand and said, you can't get it approved unless it was already working well before this date, or you'd have to go through quite a lot of regulation, which is that Class 3. And most people try and avoid the Class 3. Here's an example. Titanium is a material that's been used and been shown to be safe and effective. So if you want to come up with a new hip joint and you want to make it out of titanium, you can 510K that, because you can link it back through multiple different devices and show that it's safe to a pre-existing predicate device. However, let's say you want to make a plate, for example, here for the cranium or the skull, and you want to make it out of magnesium. Now, there are a lot of great reasons to make a plate out of magnesium. The only issue is it's going to cost you a lot of money. Why? Because magnesium has no track record, and hence it's going to cause you to go through that higher regulation. And the numbers that we use sometimes, that I tend to use with students, is that it might be, and these are just round numbers, but it might take you 10 years and $100 million. So those are numbers I've heard people say in industry for a brand new idea. And so people like to try to avoid that like the plague. They focus on making sure that their device meets a Class 2 designation. So if my students have done something that pushes them into Class 3, they need to redesign to pull it back to at least a Class 2. And I'm trying to teach them to persist through failure. And the failure here, it really isn't a failure, but just a failure to achieve a Class 2 designation. All right, so let me just kind of review where we're up to now. We started off with an opportunity and an idea, led to a business model, and now we're up to 510K. And as far as the 510K goes, they require data. It could be data from the lab. It could be data from animals, animal testing, or it could be data from humans. And this is an element where ethics come into play. And I understand we have an ethics class from Dr. Nasir's course at Lawrence Tech, so I welcome you guys to the webinar. And I want to touch on ethics because you guys are addressing that in your course. And there is an example just a few years ago where a company used a product for a purpose for which it was not intended. They were told by the FDA not to do it. They did do it. It led to charges of the company using patients as experimental subjects without their knowledge, and 5 people died. So when you get this data, you need to make sure, and I know this is obvious, but even though it's obvious, just 5 years ago this happened, that you're always working to the highest ethical standards and making sure that you're only doing things that will pass muster with the FDA. And by the way, people ended up going to jail over this. So it's a real issue. So here's an example of students writing up their 510K for FDA review. Of course, I do the FDA review. This doesn't actually get submitted in. And then the next step is the FDA, if they do give you 510K approval, will say that you need to have a quality systems regulation that guarantees good manufacturing process. And there are 2 ways you can do this. You can either pass or show that you're compliant with ISO 1345, which is basically like ISO 9000 or 9001, if you're familiar with that, but for medical devices. Or the federal government has guidelines in the Code of Federal Regulations, and it's a book or a part called Part 820. Now, turns out if you meet Part 820, then you will satisfy the FDA's guidelines. The problem is Part 820 isn't approved or acknowledged over the whole world. So if you want your product to be available to any country, it's better to seek approval or compliance with ISO 1345. And if you can become compliant with ISO 1345, then you are also compliant with Part 820. So I have my students learn what 1345 is, and they have to develop paperwork that shows they are compliant with this for their little company that they're going to form around their idea. The last thing is we want to protect our intellectual property, and to do that, I have the students draft just the first page of a patent. So they've got the sketch, who they are, and an abstract, and that at least lets me know that they're thinking about protecting their IP. Now in the winter, after all this back and forth, the physician gave feedback, they learned about 510K. A number of the students had to redesign their idea, and so they had to reshoot their commercial to make sure it was compliant and up to date. So that's what we did in winter. In the spring, I made it even a little bit more challenging, where they had to reduce the whole commercial down to a 1-page print ad. And the feedback from the students was this was more challenging than shooting the video. Here are an example of some 1-page ads. Here are the students who created the allergy identification device that would go onto your phone. You can see there's just a little device that you put your litmus paper in, and it tells you whether it's an allergen or not for you, and it keeps track of all of your food habits. And you can't really see it, but it says shellfish on there, so this is something that the guy shouldn't eat. Here's one where students came up with a way to interpret babies' cries to address shaken baby syndrome. And these students had kind of a interesting concept. This guy here, his dad was a mortician, and they sometimes struggled with moving bodies, so they came up with a concept that would actually alleviate the rigor that occurs after death. Transferability, the ideas that I was developing here, I worked with Eric Meyer out of Lawrence Tech, and he pushed these into his classroom, and so those results can be seen here. And as far as the overall plan that I used in my work, this looks very busy. Sorry about that, but let me just simplify it for you. The blue blocks are the things that are already there. The green blocks are what the keen work added to the class, and the pink are where I assessed. And the reason I bring this up is that one of the challenges I had was, how do I work this material in to an existing course? And Doug and I talked about that several times. And what I looked for was anywhere there was a redundancy, where I could be more efficient, or where I could just take an existing piece of content and kind of recast it in the keen mindset, put it in a keen wrapper. And I'm here to tell you, it's absolutely possible. You can take, at least if this class is a good example, I was able to take this course, which was packed full, and work in entrepreneurship. Here's a little bit of an assessment for my students. I elected to use the Lawrence Tech entrepreneurship survey I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the semester, and at the end I used the 1-minute paper. And here's some paraphrased comments. It's pretty simple. I need to identify the target audience and the value proposition. So the students now understand what a business model is. This work showed me I just need one great idea, passion, and some hard work. I like the creativity. There is so much to do after you come up with the initial idea. I didn't realize it until now, but I am an entrepreneur. And this video here is an overview of all of my work, and it can also be found on my YouTube channel. And with that, I am done with my talk, and I'll turn it over to Elena and Doug to facilitate questions.
So thank you very much, Pat. That was an excellent job. I am really pleased to hear that there's a class joining the webinar, and I want to let the students know, and the faculty, all the participants, that pun intended, this is cutting edge. I get an opportunity now these days to see a lot of different engineering programs, a lot of different platforms from schools within our network, schools that are outside of the network, and I can recognize, you know, what I love, honestly, Pat, as people are starting to think about the questions they're going forward. I want to mention that I really like the approach that you've taken, because first of all, you've really used the Keen framework, and you've used it in a terrific way to explain the process, and you've shown how experiential learning and can be sort of a scrimmage game, if you will, and introduce engineers to all the stakeholders, like the surgeon and others, the hospital staff, etc., others that would be involved in the process. And you can teach students to learn through failure. So you've got a lot of things going on in this particular activity that are really valuable, and again, cutting edge, as I get to see how engineers are connecting their technical work to the greater society, and to how the stakeholders that they're all engaged with, you know, making their work most relevant, and really making their work and their career most impactful. So first of all, we've got a couple of questions ourselves preloaded we can ask, but I thought I would take an opportunity at this point to say that on your control panel, as you're watching the webinar, there's a place to enter a question. So if you would start entering questions, we'll start fielding those and forwarding those on to Dr. Atkinson. All right, we've got one question. The first question is this a 2-semester course? Could you explain this course a little bit? There's a lot involved in it.
All right, yes. So I know it sounds a little chaotic, a little crazy, and I should also point out our semesters are 11 weeks long. So that's our I say semester, I mean quarter. But it's 11 weeks long, and we meet for 4 hours and 10 minutes a week, 2 hours and 5 minutes per meeting. And I take every one of my lectures up to, and sometimes a few minutes beyond, the breaking point. And It is actually all in one semester. I know it sounds like an awful lot, but what I've noticed is when you have a 2-hour and 5-minute lecture period, if you lecture the whole time, the students really zone out. And they really like going between the lecture, learn a little bit, and then apply it, learn a little bit and apply it. And the energy is so high in the room. And I should also mention, this is an 8 o'clock class at Kettering, which is our first class of the day. Students are there on time. They're ready to go. And I mean, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but they say it's their most favorite class that semester because it's so hands-on. It's so immersive. And I can tell you when students walk by the classroom, there's a lot of glass walls in our room, and people just hang out watching, you know, this strange thing going on in this classroom. All these surgeons walking around, and the students are oblivious to it. So once you get in the groove, and I think I should also mention it developed over time. I've been teaching this course for many years, and I would say in the last 2 years it's finally gelled to a product that's tight. I've shed the bad things, things that were kind of clunky, and the model I have right now is lean, it's mean, there's a lot in it, but if you come really well prepared and can really just go from item to item, it actually flows very easily. And it is one semester. Would I like to have a second semester at it? Absolutely. Unfortunately, our curriculum is pretty packed full here, and so now I should say we have a capstone later on that my colleague Dr. Tepicoli teaches, so they do have a second opportunity to pursue these ideas, but I'm doing this only in one term.
We've got another question, and do the surgeries, for example, the hip or knee replacement, take one class period or more? You know, in planning for these things, you know, what kind of length what's the contact time per student, if you could mention that again?
Excellent, that's a great question. So it is something of a controlled chaos. I've got between 5 and 10 groups of 2 people each performing surgery. First of all, you can't do any of the surgeries on your own. You need at least 2 pairs of hands. And so I go from table to table, surgical table to surgical table, kind of mentoring them along. Some of the students are very quick, and so the challenge I have is how do I keep them all at roughly the same pace? So students are really struggling. I'll sometimes jump in and get them over a very difficult step, because sometimes the students get very frustrated. It's rare, but they just reach a roadblock. So a hip joint replacement would typically take between 60 and 90 minutes, which, interestingly enough, is about how long it takes for a real hip surgery. Now, I should point out, we're not going through every tiny little step. We're not cauterizing, and we're not doing careful suturing afterwards. So for the basics, you can complete all of these surgeries in approximately 60 to 90 minutes.
I love this next question as well. It ties into, I think, even the title of this webinar. But the question is, can you talk to us about the budget for this course? You've got a lot of materials and processes.
Excellent question. So, yep, all of the materials, nearly all of the things I use can be purchased for $10 or less per item. And so depending on how your school works with your lab budget, etc., what I would encourage you to do is accumulate materials over time. But for example, the surgical instruments, I call them, they're sometimes just referred to as clamps. But the needle drivers, the towel clamps, etc., that I use, I found a company that's sold so-called floor grade, like the lowest grade, which is fine for me. They're still stainless steel. And the items were less than $10 each. And I point out to the students, a lot of these devices, you can find analogies at the hardware store. And that's why I call it dollar store surgery. There's really very little in the operating room that you couldn't find at a hardware store. For example, vice clamps are very similar to surgical clamps. They work the same way. They're just shaped a little differently and made out of stainless steel. So now the artificial bodies, they're called tall Paul, those run about $160. But again, I bought mine a few at a time over several years, stretched out my budget, and it was very easy to do it that way. I should also point out the reason I use those boxes. You might have noticed I had those wood boxes. I looked at the surgical simulation field a number of years ago and realized that these $500,000-$600,000 surgical simulation tools were really plastic boxes with a camera, and they were charging ridiculous amounts. I went to the local Joann's craft store, bought wood boxes, drilled holes, and made the same thing. So there are ways you can do this on the cheap, and you know what? It's not that schlocky. The students appreciate it, they enjoy it, and it's cheap, but it doesn't look cheap.
That's a terrific answer regarding making this accessible to students and providing a means of access so that they can understand, again, the stakeholders that are involved with the types of things that they're designing. Here's another question that's regarding access. I want to bring this class to my campus, but I have a number of knowledge gaps in the processes. You've been doing this class you've been teaching this class a long time. Do you have recommendations on how I can bridge those knowledge gaps?
Wow, Doug. Oh, boy. All right. Okay, everybody strap in. I got a long answer. No, I'll make it real quick. But I got a great answer, I think, and the way that I did it, as I look back over my career, the biggest, best influence I had was attaching myself to a local residency program. So there is a hospital probably in all of the towns that our listeners are in. And if you have a teaching hospital, I happen to be in Flint, Michigan, and we are a teaching hospital town for Michigan State University's medical school. And 1 mile away from me is McLaren Hospital. And in that hospital is an orthopedic surgery residency program. Every week, I go to fracture conference from 7 to 8 a.m. Wednesday morning, and then I see patients with the residents from 8 to 10. And I also have one of the residents, there's 15 residents in the program, 3 per year, it's a 5-year program, so there's 15 residents. Every resident during their second year lives in my lab, and we do research together. And I give them lectures on the basic science of orthopedics. But it's more than orthopedics, they are physicians, so I have to worry about all sorts of things, infection, antibiotics. I have learned so much because of the knowledge that they need to gain, and I'm basically the pardon me, I'm sorry, I'm suffering through a cold, but I am the scientist, the only scientist in the group. So whenever they have a science question, it comes to me. And so I encourage you to look in your local community for a residency program. When I went over there and said, hey, could you use a PhD, they were so grateful. And it has been a baptism by fire that continues to this day. I started going to Grand Rounds and Fracture Conference in July of 1998, and I haven't stopped. And I have learned so much, and I have taught so much. And when you do that, it's a process. You're not going to learn it overnight, but you got to start somewhere, and you can't. No time like today to get started. So that would be my recommendation.
That's terrific. As you have more questions, please type them into the control panel. Here's one more that might be related to, well, we can couple a couple of things related to the last question. How do you convince physicians to commit their time? And in a related way, is it important to bring in the external experts? How important is committing that time in the classroom to that?
That's a great question. So most physicians are in a private practice, which means they have lots of bills, and if they're not seeing patients, they're not making money. So you may or may not know this, but a resident is already a fully fledged medical doctor. They've completed medical school, but they're not board certified in any one of their in any specialties. So when I have those residents working in my lab, it's very easy to say, hey, I need you to come upstairs for a couple minutes or a couple hours and work with my students. And you know, I'm providing a service to the residency where I'm opening up my lab and mentoring the residents, and they are more than happy to help me out. So again, I get back to that idea that if you're in your town, you've got a teaching hospital, either medical students or residents are great resources. I'll also mention that most of the medical schools now, pardon me, I'm sorry, require that their medical students provide service. For example, Michigan State University's medical school in Flint requires that the students do 40 hours of community service. And that is a great way to get a medically knowledgeable person into your facility. Now, as far as the medical device manufacturers, I tend to go to the path of least resistance, and while I could get somebody to come and drive 3-4 hours to Flint and help us out, what I've noticed is my class is so tightly packed that bringing somebody in for an hour is not necessarily the luxury I have. And so I tend to try and shape all that material and shape that message myself through my lectures. I've also noticed, just in my experience, when you have industry experts come in, it's kind of a little bit of a crapshoot as to how the talk's going to go, how relevant it's going to be, and if they're not really good presenters, that sometimes is kind of a waste of time. So I tend to just bring in the physicians and handle all the rest of the lecture material myself.
That's terrific. Pat, as we start to wrap up, we've got one more question, which I think is an easy answer question. Would you be willing to share your slide deck? And I'll answer part of that. The webinar itself we will make available, and I would defer to you on if your willingness to share the slide deck.
Absolutely. This work was funded by Keene, and it's whoever wants it, it's yours. I'll give it to anybody.
And then also just to re-mention that you have the website, which is populated with the work. And are there other materials and the videos on that website at this point?
No, it's just the videos. But Doug, I would mention also that my final report to Keene has got a lot of these slides in it, or some of these slides in it. So maybe you could speak to how those could become available to people.
Certainly, we can make those available through our website and especially through our program assistant, Elena Greenfield. But then also, one of the things we're going to be doing at our winter conference in January is featuring topical grants like Pat's and many others, so that the deliverables, so that you can have a deeper conversation about this topic if you're attending that winter conference. And perhaps use these right away in your class and provide some feedback. The overall goal of the network is to develop an entrepreneurial mindset and develop some of the best teaching materials around. Develop the best library of teaching materials around, and we believe that things like this are certainly on the right path. With that, thank you, Pat, very much. Thank you for connecting this work to Keene. I think it's a terrific addition, especially for biomedical engineering. And so thanks to everyone who participated, especially the students that are out there, and we will be talking to you soon. Elena, do you have any last minute? No, she does not. So with that, thanks again, everyone, and have a great balance of your day.